Okay, today let's talk about fueling for endurance athletes. Now, fueling for endurance athletes is a little different than power athletes. They have more of a carbohydrate demand, like total daily carbohydrates are a little higher. They got to consume a little more because the nature of what they do just expends a little more energy. And so we're going to talk about total daily consumption as well as before a meet for like a cross-country athlete. And then if you are the type of athlete doing a really sustained duration endurance feat, I'm talking like your 2-hour practices, and this could be your football player even doing a 2-hour practice, or a basketball player with a 2-hour practice. Usually if you're practicing for more than 70 minutes, you should probably be supplementing inside of your training session with extra carbohydrates. Otherwise, what happens is your performance just starts plummeting, and you're more in just a state of survival. Now, most athletes have trained their whole life in a state of survival. They don't eat enough carbohydrates in a day, and they don't consume enough carbohydrates during a training session. And so they're used to that. And so some of these numbers might sound like a lot of carbohydrate consumption to them, but that's because they've never experienced what it's like to actually be adequately fueled and actually an hour and a half into practice still feel like they have pop and some drive that they can give. They're more just like looking at the clock like, when is this done? So for an endurance athlete, if you are building up your carbohydrate consumption for, let's say, a meet where you want to ideally perform, carb loading doesn't just happen the night before, like a lot of people historically have practiced. A lot of the times you have a meet on a Friday or a game on a Friday, and that Thursday night you have like a big spaghetti feed and you shove a bunch of carbs in your mouth and you're like, there, my carbs are loaded. But really, carbohydrate loading has to occur for some amount of an extended time. So usually 1 to 2 days, depending on like how aggressive the physical feat you will be performing on that Friday is. If it's just a 5K, then probably 1 day of carbohydrate loading will do the trick. But if it's a marathon, a couple of days, 2 days is way more ideal to make sure that your carbohydrates are super compensated for in your body. And so 3.6 to 5.5 grams per pound of body weight a day is considered ideal for that like loading up. And so if you're a 130-pound cross-country athlete, you kind of need to be consuming between 460 and 700 grams of carbs a day. Now, most people should always start on the lower end of ideal, because that 700 grams, that's for like the exceptionally stressed athlete. That's the D1 cross-country athlete that's got meet after meet. That's the Olympian. That's the ultra-marathon runner. That's the person who's doing a really hard feat. But if you're doing like a 5K, a half marathon, etc., you're definitely okay with being on the lower end of that carbohydrate consumption. So for that 130-pound female, that still puts you at 460 grams of carbs a day. And if you're not used to eating that, because remember what we talked about in our previous video, a fistful is about 40 to 45 grams of carbs. So if you need to eat 460 grams of carbs, you need about 10 to 11 fistfuls of carbs a day. If you're not used to eating that, maybe you're only used to eating like a fistful or 1.5 fistfuls for 3 meals. So you're only used to like 5 fistfuls of carbs a day. It's gonna seem like a lot. So don't just jump up to 10 fistfuls a day. Spend a week or so at 6 fistfuls, then spend another week at 7 fistfuls of carbs a day. A fistful too is kind of easy to calculate, because like 2 slices of bread, if you like condensed it, kind of looks like a fistful. A big scoop of rice kind of looks like a fistful. And so making it easy on yourself to like serve yourself some spaghetti and be like, that's 1 fistful, that's 2. It makes the mental math easier instead of trying to remember the exact amount of grams you need. but building up to that lower end at least of the ideal range will maybe expose you to a level of energy you've never had, a level of vigor you've never had from a week of training. Maybe you've always been training in such a survival state that really you've never optimally performed and you just don't know it. You're just used to being malnourished for the physical feats you're trying to perform. Now, for endurance athletes, before their practice or meet or game, they want to consume carbs 3 to 4 hours before. Everyone's a little different. Some people don't empty food as quickly, or maybe you have more complex carbs like potatoes, or you're eating simpler carbs like Pop-Tarts. Pop-Tarts are going to digest a lot quicker than potatoes. And so if you're eating potatoes, you might want to eat it closer to 4 hours before your meet or your race or whatever. But if you're having a simpler carb, maybe you try to have it closer to that like 3 hour mark before. But a female who's 130 pounds ideally wants to consume 0.5 gram to 1.4 grams in that meal before. So that's like 65 to 180 grams. So it's like a fist and a half to anywhere from a fist and a half to 4 fists of carbs, and everyone's going to be a little different. So always start on the lower range and then slowly build it up. If normally you have like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, that might be like 1.5 fistfuls, because 2 slices of bread kind of looks like a fistful, and then jam in and of itself is really dense with carbs, and so it's really easy to put 20-25 grams of jam on a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and not think that much about it. So maybe you start there, and then maybe you build up, and that would be 1.5, and then maybe you build up to like a sandwich and a half, or a sandwich and a banana, or a sandwich, a banana, and a granola bar, and you start seeing how much food you can consume, because towards the higher end, optimal performance will occur if the physical feat you're doing requires it. So play with the amount you consume and see what the ideal range for you is. Now, if you're doing something prolonged, like a 2-hour practice, which is super common for a lot of athletes, you have to fuel during that. If what we consider a long duration, which is 70 minutes, if you're doing something physical for more than 70 minutes that's exertional, you should be supplementing carbs throughout the process. And so if you have a 2-hour basketball practice, you should be consuming 30 to 60 grams of carbs an hour. And so that you usually want it to be in something that digests really quickly, like a liquid carb like Gatorade. And so a lot of Gatorades might be 20 to 30 grams. And so 1 Gatorade per hour might do the trick. Me personally, I like using like that powder Kool-Aid and throwing it in my water bottle, and that's about 30 grams of carbs. So if I'm doing just like a 1-hour weightlifting session, 30 grams of carbs does the trick for me. But you want to ideally consume enough carbs in a day. You want to consume enough carbs right before your workout. And then if your workout's really long or your training session's really long, you also need to consume carbs within that to squeak out optimal performance. And some people just aren't used to feeling optimal, and so these values sound really high for them. But we've done the research, we know the stats and the data, and your body will perform better off of hitting this ideal range.